Hi there. We'll start officially in just a bit, but before we begin, so if you can make sure your name in Zoom has both your first and your last name. And if you don't see that, hover over your name, click more, and then click rename to edit. So if you're interested in getting CTLE credit today, we'll ask you to type your full name into the chat at the end of the webinar. So we make sure we have you one way or another or both ways to be able to get your credits today. So your credit, one credit today. So we know how important that is. So today, Sydney and I are going to be talking about advocating for culturally responsive teaching for multilingual learners. And we will introduce ourselves in just a bit. And so we want to share and acknowledge that this webinar is sponsored by the New York State Language Arbor, or Regional Bilingual Education Resource Network, in conjunction with NYU Steinhardt. So thank you so much to our sponsors today. Sydney, want to go ahead and...
Yes, so welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. My name is Sydney Snyder, and I'm a principal associate at Support Ed. We're a women-owned small business focused on educational advocacy and equity for multilingual learners and their families. I've been with Support Ed for almost 10 years now, and before that, I was an ESOL teacher for many years. So I'm really excited to be here with you this evening.
Hi, and I'm Diane Stairfenner. I'm president of Support Ed, and like Sydney said, we're a women-owned small business. We are based in the Washington, D.C. metro area, and we support multilingual learners and their families and their teachers and administrators. And we provide technical assistance and professional development and curriculum support to educators just to ensure and to work towards equity for multilingual learners. So we're really happy to be here. I'm going to kind of do the first half of the presentation, and then Sydney's going to take over, just so you know how we're structuring things today. So we want to start off, as always, by saying thank you to, saying thank you for everything everyone has been doing, especially this year, and a year to end all years, and for joining us today at the end of this school year, at the very end of your day. So we are super appreciative to have you here. So just before we get started, sharing a couple of tips. So you have your control bar. If you have any content questions, please click on the Q&A button, anything that we're talking about content related, and just commenting or chatting or sharing, reacting, please use the chat button. Or if you have any technical difficulties, let us know by the chat as well. And make sure on your chat settings that you have it set to all panelists and attendees, unless you want to share something just with us. So that way we can all be in on the conversation. So thanks. And any messages coming from Sydney or me, well, most of them will start with 3 asterisks. So you'll be able to tell what's coming from us. So as I mentioned, you can get a CTLE certificate after this webinar is finished. So we'll provide you a Zoom participant, we'll provide a Zoom participant report to New York State Arbor, Language Arbor, and that includes the name of the participant, their email address, and the number of minutes they were in the session today, so that the Arbor can issue participants their CTLE certificates. And then as an extra measure, at the end of today's session, we'll ask you just to add your name in the chat, so we can kind of cross-reference. So this webinar is part of a series for the New York State Language Arbor. Today is May 12th, and so we're focusing on advocacy in our 1-hour webinar. Last week, we gave an introduction to culturally responsive teaching for multilingual learners. And then the next piece of this, and you don't have to do all 3 parts, is if you're interested in doing a bit of a deeper dive, there's a 3-hour regional, there are separate 3-hour regional PDs in May and June, where we'll be delving in more to the 5 principles of culturally responsive teaching for multilingual learners. So our objectives for today, we have 4, and they're to discuss the role of advocacy in fostering a culturally responsive climate for multilingual learners, to explore a 5-step advocacy process to strengthen culturally responsive teaching for multilingual learners, for you to reflect on tools and strategies we're going to share with you today to support your advocacy work and supporting CRT, culturally responsive teaching for multilingual learners. And then finally, for you to set goals for strengthening CRT in your classrooms and schools. So we have a Padlet that we've created for this session, and I think Sydney's going to share the link to that in the chat. You can also type in bit.ly/CRT, the number 4 MLs 2021, and that's case sensitive. And so this Padlet kind of curates all of the resources that we'll be sharing today, and you'll have them all in one place. And this will remain live after our session today, so you can take a look at it later. And whenever you see this little origami crane in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, it means a resource we're sharing is also on the Padlet. And you might be familiar with our new book, Culturally Responsive Teaching for Multilingual Learners, to hold it up the right way. So the content in our session today is really aligned with our final chapter in the book, which is called Putting It All Together. So we've briefly introduced ourselves. So using the chat function in Zoom, share one word to describe how you're feeling about advocating for multilingual learners this year. So just one word. How are you feeling about advocating? Great. I see determined, empowered, enthusiastic, hopeful. Awesome. Great. I'm loving the tone. Hopeful, eager, committed, determined. Great. I see a lot of threads. Passionate. Oh, we have one stressed. That's okay. Thanks for sharing how you're feeling. Driven and glad. Thanks. Keep it coming. Keep it coming as we move into our next piece, relieved and excited. So we're going to get started by talking about the role of advocacy in fostering a culturally responsive school climate. Oops. And just to make sure we're all on the same page, we want to make sure that we share a common definition of what culture is. So we'll just take a brief look at that. And if you were here with us last week, you've seen this as well. So just to recap, culture, there are many, many definitions, but it can be seen as a system of shared beliefs, values, customs, behaviors, and artifacts that the members of a society use to interact with their world and with one another. So, and there are many varied definitions, and we want to also stress that it's complex and dynamic. You can be members of different groups concurrently, we all are, and there's a huge range of variability between and within social groups. And so culture, again, it's complex, it's dynamic, and we're all members of different cultural groups, and like I just said, there's a great variability within groups. So we can explore that in a bit and be thinking of that as we think of culture and the relationship to your school and your context. So let's think about how culture would apply to the school context. So a classroom or school setting or even district level. So in the chat, you don't have to respond to all of these questions, but think about and share, what would you expect to see, hear, or feel in a culturally responsive classroom or school? So what might you see or hear as you enter the building? Just go ahead and share it in the chat. What comes to mind? What might you see on the walls in the library or in the cafeteria? What would you see and hear during instruction? And how might you feel? Yeah, Lily says multiple languages being spoken and displayed, and diversity, different languages. Welcome or hello in many languages, right? We might want to expect that as you're entering the building, just kind of creating that feeling and that sense of inclusivity and welcoming. Yeah, we want to see translations and diversities, discussions, and an inclusive library, right? With multilingual resources from your students' home languages. Yeah, a librarian-run library, absolutely, curated to be responsive to the students. Educators smiling with welcoming postures. Absolutely. Welcoming, safe and comfortable. Yeah, different languages, right. And so how would that feel, right? That feels welcoming. Can you think of any other words to describe how that climate might feel to you? So keep thinking. Yeah, and safe, absolutely. So important now, right? We think of being safe from the pandemic, but are we also feeling safe to our multilingual families? Great. So we want to share our 5 guiding principles of culturally responsive teaching. And we'll look a little bit about those and do a poll on them next. So be thinking about which is the most important to you in your context. So culturally responsive teaching is assets-based. Our second guiding principle, and this frames the chapters in our book as well too. The second is that it simultaneously supports and also challenges students. And the third is that it places students at the center of learning. The fourth is that it leverages students' linguistic and cultural backgrounds. And the fifth is that it unites students, schools, families, and communities. So that's a lot to think about, right? So we'd like to share a poll with you. So as you consider the guiding principles, where do you think there's the greatest need for advocacy in your context? So we want to take these guiding principles and apply them to advocacy. So hopefully you can see this on your screens. I've launched the poll. I sure hope you can see it. Yeah, you've started responding. Good. Okay, good. And Sydney's smiling, so that's a good sign. So where's the biggest need for advocating in your context? So is it the first, assets-based perspective, supporting and challenging students, placing students at the center of learning, leveraging their linguistic and cultural backgrounds, or really uniting schools, families, and communities? So please go ahead and click on the area that you think where advocacy is most needed, where you are. I do see one coming in, a little bit of a lead here, but we'll give you another few seconds to catch up. About 70% of you have voted at this point. Great. We'll let it hit 80. We'll get herd immunity on voting here. Okay. And I will share that with you. Hopefully can you see it, Sydney? Okay, great. So you said, 30% of you said that providing instruction that places students at the center of learning. Great, that's the biggest need for advocacy. And the second one would be leveraging students' linguistic and cultural backgrounds. Great, so we'll be thinking about that as we continue. So now that we've looked at, which guiding principle you might want to focus on the most when advocating, let's share in the chat which picture or pictures best represents what it looks like to advocate for multilingual learners in your context. Is it A, B, C, or D? And if you get a chance, why did you choose that image? And this is a great exercise you can do with students too, right? Like which image speaks to you the most and why? A lot of you are saying B. So the fist bump. We've got a C, the referees, and a D, the slow snail. Great, yeah, and someone who wrote D said that there can be struggles along the way and a joining of forces. Absolutely. Yeah, and Melissa says it's doable, but takes a lot of time and effort, so D. Great. Thanks, yeah, keep sharing if you'd like. And yeah, we're really asking you to share a lot today, and here's another opportunity. So in terms of advocacy, how would you define advocacy for multilingual learners? What would you consider, what would be a quick definition of advocacy for you? There's so many definitions. I actually, if you're familiar with my work, wrote a book on advocating for English learners. And in it, I look at I have a definition for advocacy that I'm going to share with you in a bit. But yeah, what's your definition of advocacy? Yeah, Brianna says making sure the students get what they need. Natalie says equity and access for all. Yeah, access and equity, fighting for what students need to receive equal access. Challenging systems of inequity? Absolutely. Great. Yeah, so keep them coming. Full entrance to the curriculum, leveling the playing field, support, access, equity, social justice. Yeah, advocating with co-teachers who have not been trained in co-teaching. Yeah, so we're gonna take a look at, where the word advocacy comes from. It comes from Latin advocatus, meaning one called to aid, or speaking or acting on behalf of another. And then some cognates in other languages are abogado, advogado, or avocat. So if you're familiar with one or more of those languages, what does that mean? What does that mean? We'll see who gets it first. Yep, a lawyer, right? A lawyer or an attorney. So you would hire a lawyer to help you navigate some kind of uncharted territory, unfamiliar environment, and you expect that they're going to represent you. So we do the same thing as advocates for our students. So just kind of looking at what advocacy means. This is my definition from my book, Advocating for English Learners. And so my definition is constantly changing. So it means, it's working for our students' equitable and excellent education by taking appropriate actions on their behalf. Also, to do so, you have to have a deep understanding about each student and their family's background to know which action is appropriate to take. And also providing and helping students and families strengthen their voice. For those students and families who have not yet developed their own strong voice in their education. And this word yet is really important because it implies that they're going to get there, that they're going to develop their own strong voice. And along those lines, I coined the term scaffolded advocacy for multilingual learners and their families. So if we're in the classrooms, right, we provide scaffolding and instruction, providing that just right amount of support to students so they can complete a task that they can't yet complete independently or individually. Well, we want to do the same thing with advocacy, that we scaffold our advocacy for our students and families with the idea that we're removing the advocacy and the scaffolding so they'll be able to effectively advocate for themselves, really drawing from their strengths, collaborating intensively with our families and with our students to be able to advocate together. And we also want to bring in this idea of sharing the responsibility and also the joy that comes from working with multilingual learners and really seeing what their strengths are. So I have a framework that I developed in my Advocating for English Learners book that looks at a few areas. The first, to be able to build the responsibility, but also more importantly, the joy that comes from working with our students, is developing an assets-based approach to examining our colleagues' beliefs and educations around language and working with multilingual learners. Having educators reflect on their own culture and its impact on their teaching, which is something we devote an entire chapter to in our new book. Helping individuals build empathy for and building relationships with multilingual learners and their families. And then collaboration, strengthening that collaboration among ELL teachers, content teachers, and administrators. So we really need to look at all four of these areas to help share the responsibility and the joy. So we all feel equal joy in working with multilingual learners. So I'd like for you to think of one time you advocated for an ML student or an ML family. What did you do? Write it in the chat, but don't hit enter. This is called a waterfall chat. And we get this idea from Esther Park, who's a wonderful educator who has great ideas. So go ahead and enter it in the chat, but wait until I say go and then hit send. So write it in the chat, sorry. And then when I say go, hit enter to send it. So one time you advocated for an ML student or an ML family. Just a couple of lines. What did you do? We'll give you a minute. The silence is deafening. Yeah, so we'll give you a minute. What do you think, Sydney? A few more seconds?
Yeah, maybe just a little bit.
Okay. Wait time is so hard online. So we're going to do this one time you advocated, and then we're going to take one poll, and then I'll turn it over to Sydney. All right. So I'm going to count down and say go. So 3, 2, 1, go. Hit enter.
Nice.
Nice. Wow. All right. I will try scrolling up here. Someone helped them, students with kind of financial aid forms. Virginia helped a family find mental health resources, which is huge right now, right? And it's another area that I'm studying a bit more, especially now with the pandemic. Someone got tutoring for a family of 4 ELL students during COVID through a local organization. There's so many great examples. Somebody helped provide legal support or connect them with legal support. Advocating when the student felt like he was not being supported in his content classes. Spoke with the assistant principal. That is so tough. Yeah, someone said they have so many stories, just so many stories to tell. Giving extra time for tutoring. There's so many more messages coming in. Vetoing speech services for a student who couldn't pronounce the TH sound at age 7. Oh, stories, so many stories about that. I was a dual language assessment teacher, so doing assessments for students that were part of the pre-referral process for special education, we would see young students all the time getting referred for speech and language when, we knew it was a language acquisition issue, or we suspected. So we hear that all of the time. Translating, helping the family find adult English classes. Great. So many great examples. So, we can be thinking about, what's an area that you would like to work to strengthen in your context? And I'm going to launch this poll. So hopefully you can see it. If not, if you for some reason can't click on the poll, just share in the chat. So do you think it's educators using an assets-based approach for their work with multilingual learners? Educators reflecting on their own culture? Right, this is to share the responsibility and the joy. Educators collaborating in support of MLs. Educators showing empathy for and building relationships with multilingual learners. So where are you in your context? Maybe think at your, in your school, in your district. What do you think, might need to be strengthened in your context? So we've got about 60% of people have voted right now. We'll give you another minute here so we can get more people to vote. Great, I will end this poll. So it's the collaboration piece that 41% of you shared, that would be the area to work on the most. Great. And Sydney, I believe I will stop sharing and let Sydney take over.
Great, thank you. So we're going to be talking more about that idea of collaboration and collaborating around advocacy for culturally responsive teaching, because I think that is so huge, right? There are so many different aspects to culturally responsive teaching, and that collaboration piece is really key. Next, we're going to be talking about a 5-step advocacy process. And this was adapted from the National Education Association. They have a guiding paper called All In, How Educators Can Advocate for English Language Learners. And they use this framework. We adapted it somewhat, changed the steps around a little bit, and tweak the language, but we want to use this now to think about advocacy related to culturally responsive teaching. And I'm going to be talking about each of these 5 steps, but the steps are to isolate the issue, know students and families' rights and relevant research, develop your allies, identify your outlets for change, and organize and educate others. So the first step is isolating the issue. And this is really making sure that you know what the advocacy issue is, because sometimes you may think that you know what the challenge is, but it might be something else. So this step helps you to focus your advocacy efforts. It's a time to gather information from stakeholders, so you do make sure you know what your advocacy steps should be. And this is also a time to reframe that deficit perspective. So often when we're looking at particular challenges, they can be framed in a deficit framework. So how can we change that to think about the assets that the stakeholders are already bringing? And I see Diane has shared the All-In handbook in the chat. So thank you, Diane. I want to share now a scenario to help us thinking about how to use this framework. So this is the scenario. Administration and kindergarten teachers are upset that some ML families don't register their kindergarten students for school before the school year begins. And I saw someone share that their advocacy step that they had taken was to help enroll a kindergarten student. So this ties in nicely with that. And information about these pre-registration events are shared through local media and on school social media channels. So this is how it's promoted, but still there are ML families that aren't registering their students before the start of the year, which makes it challenging to know how many students will be there to do the language assessments that might be needed and other assessments so that teachers know who's entering their classes. What do you think might be the issue, and what steps could you take to learn more? So if you'll take a minute and just share in the chat your thoughts on this scenario, what you think could be the issue and what steps you might take. So I see, looks like some teachers need to walk the neighborhoods and leave flyers. So looking at local shops, whether it's the bodega, the hair salon, to leave information about registration. So some of the issues might be related to language, resources, tech access, right? What's the expectation for the registration? Not all parents are using the social media, or they might not be sharing the information in languages of the families' home languages. Outreaching to preschool programs, great. Having incorrect contact information, great. Providing translations, I saw someone shared, great. Utilizing community resources, churches, nice, right. So all these are strategies for collaborating to have better outreach, to start to build these relationships with families. Thank you. Please feel free to keep adding because I love hearing all these great ideas. Thank you. So the second step is to know students and families' rights and relevant research. And this is really essential in your advocacy because it gives you a place to speak from, right? If you have those rights behind you, if you have research that backs up your ideas, then you have a stronger foundation for your advocacy efforts. And so some questions to ask yourself about any advocacy issue that you're working on are, what are the rights of MLs and their families related to these efforts? And what does the research tell us? So as an example of the rights of multilingual learners, we know that students, regardless of language proficiency, are entitled to equal opportunity to participate in all programs, right? So we know that those students have equal rights to participate in the kindergarten program and that registration, and that schools must communicate in a language that families can understand. That is a right of MLs, that they share all information that is shared in English. So any information that's being shared in English must be shared in families' home languages, and that they must respond to a parent or guardian's request for language assistance. So again, anytime there's a request, the schools have an obligation to provide those language support. The third step is to develop your allies. And the allies are defined as a person or group that provides assistance and support in ongoing effort, activity, or struggle. And I think that this is really key when we think back to that image of the snail crawling up, and we think about how it can be challenging sometimes to advocate, and it can feel very isolating. So having allies who you know are working towards a common goal is really important. Some possible allies could be colleagues, multilingual learners and their families, other families, specialists, administration in your school, district community liaisons, school organizations such as the PTA, community service organizations, and local businesses and other community organizations. So these are all potential allies. What I'd love to do now is have you share who is an ally that supports you in your advocacy work and what makes him or her an ally. So those two characteristics, who is an ally and what makes that person an ally? What do they do? And I see that the idea of sharing connected to the case study, it's really important for parents to know that legal status, being undocumented, is not a criteria for public education, right? So really making sure that families know that schools can't ask about status. So I see the district ENL specialist is always advocating. Also the ENL teachers, district ESL coordinator, great, parent coordinator, teachers who interact daily and share concerns, right? So thinking about how we can expand our allies beyond those who maybe it's their job to be advocates, right? Yeah, great. Who else do you think? ENL teachers. A reading specialist, okay, making literacy come alive, nice. Parents, great, I love that. Yeah, we definitely want parents and families to be our allies in this work. School psychologists, nice. Great. Teachers who speak other languages, right? Makes them. The PTA, great. So thinking about how you can connect with school organizations. Nice. Parent coordinator, assistant principal. Great. Thank you so much. The students themselves. Yeah, I love that idea. We really want to be working with students, especially as they get older, and supporting them and being self-advocates. Community organizations, alumni. Nice. Thank you so much. Keep adding. I'd love to see all these allies. So Paul Gorski talks about our sphere of influence, and step 4 is to identify our outlets of change. And this is really important for us to think about what we have control over in our environment and what we don't have control over, right? There's so many things that we could make a wish list of things that we would like to change. There's so many things that we could say, but it becomes important then to prioritize based on things that you can control. And based on this, I want to talk about the advocacy ripple effect, which Diane talks about in her book. And this connects to kind of our sphere of influence. So as we advocate for within our classroom, we have a certain sphere of influence, and it's very important for the students that we're advocating for, but our advocacy expands and grows the more we are able to collaborate with others, just as you mentioned, just as you talked about how important that was. So when that teacher advocates with other teachers outside the classroom, at the school level, at the district level, the advocacy ripple effect is able to grow and expand, and the support we're able to provide students increases. So I'd like now to have you share in the chat, what is a step that you have taken or could take to increase the impact of your advocacy work in your context? So thinking about those things that you've done, the things that you wrote in the chat, also thinking about your allies. What's something that you could do right now to expand the impact of your advocacy? Related to something that you think is really important in your context. And I'll give you a minute. I know this is kind of a hard question, but I'd love to hear in the chat, what's a step that you have already taken or that you want to take to increase the impact of your advocacy? I'll give you just a minute to respond. Communicate with teachers across the district. Okay, so again, thinking about that collaboration piece and how you communicate with others to support the needs of ELLs or multilingual learners. Great, thank you for sharing. Write a white paper about the challenges for ENL teachers. Nice. So also think about how you can self-advocate, right? Support monolingual teachers with information about their students. Great, so key. So sharing that student information, student data. Work and speak directly with administration. A great one. Yeah, really being transparent about the needs and speaking up. Educating teachers about second language acquisition process and students having to do double the work. Nice, great. Using the Talking Points app with students and families to communicate with them. It's been an amazing, great. So using that, amazing how a tech tool can really benefit. Nice. Putting teachers in the position of ML students. Great, thank you. Please keep adding. These are all great ideas. All right, so finally, the final step is to organize and educate others. So we have our allies, and now we want to expand our advocacy efforts. And some of this is through the use of talking points, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about, using opportunities to expand on existing programs and infrastructure. So again, looking for what's already in place that you can add to as a way so you don't have to start from scratch. Collaborating with others in the community, and you shared lots of ideas for that. And, and it could be including community colleges, nonprofit organizations. There's so many, especially now, there's so many organizations that are doing such great work in supporting our families. So how can we work with them? And then reflecting on progress and celebrating successes. So as we said, it can be a long process, right? When you're in it for the long haul. So making sure that you acknowledge that process and really take time to celebrate the successes. What I want to do now is I want to show you a video. We were very fortunate to be able to film in Syracuse City School District for our book. And I'm going to show you a short video clip, and I'd like you to share how in the video these family meet and greets are an example of advocacy for MLs in the Syracuse City School District community, and what takeaways do you have from the video? So be thinking about those as we watch the video. All right.
So in an effort to help educators build relationships with our multilingual families, we host events like tonight, our parent meet and greet. We do twice a year at multiple locations, and we invite all the teachers in the district to come, as well as all the families, because we feel like it's important to meet families where they are. So we want to change the face of engagement. We don't always want it to be parents coming to us. We want to go to them. And so that's what we're doing here tonight, is meeting families where they are on a neutral ground, and hopefully that will help build those relationships. And you can use this opportunity to talk about your students or your children and how well they're doing in classes, or just talk about their interests and things that would help the teacher help them in school.
My name is Sisi. I live here almost 5 years. Okay. I have 5 children. Yeah, 3 boys, 2 girls. Sorry.
It's 2 boys,
2 boys, 3 girls.
My name is Idemi, and I'm the second daughter.
Understand only Vietnamese.
She said she don't have any question, but she just want you guys to just help us out.
Absolutely.
Have any help.
One thing that I would encourage you to start doing because you're in 11th grade is to start thinking about what you want to do after high school, right? Because if there's colleges that you want to visit or things that you want to do in terms of what your plans are for the future, now is a good time to start gathering information about that.
And
She said one of her teachers told her that there's gonna be teachers coming around from the school district, so it kind of gave us a chance to talk with the teachers, and so that's why she came here.
right. So go ahead and share in the chat. How are these family meet and greets an example of advocacy for MLs in the Syracuse City School District, or any takeaways that you had from the video? Allowing them to feel part of the school community, right? So I see the question about attendance being a challenge. And I think one aspect of this is they were doing it in a center where adults were already coming to learn English. So that piece of how you can create a space where families feel comfortable, and having language classes for adults is one way to increase comfort level in the schools, I know. But I'd love to hear other ideas of how do you kind of increase that family engagement piece? How do you encourage families to come? Right, having a neutral space, including food. So again, what were the things that they did to make it accessible? They did it in a space that families were familiar with. They offered food. They had interpreters for all languages. And their teachers were the ones that shared that information. Yeah. Nancy said, educators need to be proactive to reach out to families. Great, thank you. All right, feel free to keep adding. I'd love to hear more ideas. Next, we're going to be talking a little bit about tools and strategies to support our activity work, our advocacy work. And I'm going to be talking about using talking points, establishing leadership, and dealing with conflict, and then determining priorities and setting goals, and sharing some tools around these. So the first is using talking points, and talking points are succinct statements that can help send a message that you can use when you're advocating, that you can share with stakeholders, whether it's colleagues, administrators, or others in the community. And you can use these to explain your advocacy work and your position. So some steps for writing that is, first, draft your key succinct message. And here's an example going back to that kindergarten pre-registration scenario. We need to remove barriers that prevent ML families from pre-registering their children for kindergarten. And then revise your message to emphasize a win-win. So you really want to show how everyone is going to win in the situation. In this case, if we remove the barriers that prevent ML families from pre-registering, we'll have fewer students that haven't registered at the beginning of the year, and we'll have more information about our incoming students, including their strengths and needs. So again, if we put in a little more effort up front, it's really going to pay off. It's going to be a win-win situation. The next point is to anticipate pushback. So in our advocacy work, we always need to be prepared for that pushback, or those deficit statements, or arguing the other side. So thinking ahead of time can be really helpful as you're thinking about your talking points. So possible pushback might be, oh, we don't have time, we don't have the resources needed, or families won't be interested, families won't attend. So then, as you're thinking about that, the next step is to add talking points to address the pushback. So be prepared for that pushback. And consider the role that you might take. So for example, I'm happy to take the lead in developing a series of ML family pre-registration events. By offering these events, we can begin to build school and ML family partnerships that will have long-term benefits for student learning. The ML families that I've spoken to have indicated their interest. So again, doing that initial surveying of all the stakeholders, right? So going back to that first point of isolating the issue. And then it can be really helpful to rehearse and role play, right? Because when you're in that situation, you're ready to advocate, you're armed, and then you get a point or a pushback and you're not ready. So having an ally role play with you, so you're really ready when you go to have that conversation with someone who might be a little bit tougher, is a great strategy. So what we're going to do now is going back to an issue that you're thinking about, that we've been talking about. What is a talking point you can use? So I want to give you a minute and have you share what's an issue that you're grappling with, an advocacy issue that you're grappling with, and what's a talking point that you might use in order to organize and educate others. All right, we'll take just a minute or two. I'm gonna keep going so that we have some time for Q&A at the end. But if you've thought of something or you're just finishing up, feel free to go ahead and share it, because I think hearing the other issues that you're grappling with and the talking points that you want to use can be really helpful. I see Alana says that the E&L coordinator is also the superintendent and struggling with really struggling with time to speak to him. Okay, so that idea of time, how you can try and get the time that you need to make those statements. I think that's a really important point. Yeah, so hearing, I'm seeing something that sounds like a deficit perspective. Oh, the mom of one of my ELLs doesn't care about education. And that's something I think that we've heard, especially during this year, right? That the parents haven't taken the responsibility. And so thinking about how you respond to that by recognizing the challenges that families have had throughout this year is really important. Please feel free to keep sharing. I want to share a tool that can be used to help establish leadership and successfully deal with conflict. And this is shared on the Padlet. So these are some things, again, thinking about when there might be challenges, some tools, some steps you might take, and some considerations for each of those steps. So I encourage you to check that out on the Padlet for more. And I also want to share this tool for to help you determine priorities and set goals. And again, it's connected to this advocacy work. It asks you to think through some of these things that we've talked about, some of these questions. So it can be really helpful to think about the talking points that you want to use, the steps you want to take, short and long-term goals. All these things can be really helpful as you're thinking through your advocacy work. Oh, yes, we can post the link. Oh, Diane just did it. She posted the link to the Padlet. Great, thank you so much. So again, this is on the Padlet, this tool. So we're gonna go ahead now and start to wrap up and take time for some questions. But as we think about wrapping up, I just wanna share Paul Gorski's idea of building equity literacy. And this really connects to advocacy work. It really connects to culturally responsive teaching, because it's the work that we do to really think about the inequities in our context and the steps that we need to take. And so the first step is really recognizing those inequities. So, and helping others to recognize them, right? Because sometimes we're very aware of inequities, but we need to use talking points to be able to share what those inequities look like in our context. And then helping them respond, and then thinking about how we can respond to these inequities in the immediate term, but then also in the long term. So there are things that can be done immediately, but we also need to have long-term goals to working towards removing those inequities. And then finally, sustaining equity efforts even in the face of resistance. And we've talked about that with having talking points to respond to pushback, as we think about that snail crawling through, like all these things are to help us think about how we can keep going even when it's challenging and hard. I want to share two other tools that are on the Padlet. The first is the checklist and goal setting related to the 5 guiding principles of culturally responsive teaching. We shared this, if you were here last week, we shared it then, and we talked more about that. And the second one is an inequity literacy tool. And these are just to raise some areas, some ideas of possible inequities that are experienced by many multilingual learners throughout the country. So these are some things for you to think about in your own school, to collect some data on if you think it's an issue, or you can choose another area if you think another area is an issue. All right. So as we think on our advocacy goals, what's one goal or priority you have to strengthen culturally responsive teaching for MLs in your context? And what's one advocacy step that you'll take? And we'll just take a minute or two to have you share. And I know that you've been sharing. So the idea of differentiating instruction, I'm seeing, stopping blaming the students. Yeah, so again, helping shift from that deficit perspective to an assets one, including more diverse literature. Yeah, these are all great suggestions. And feel free, I'm gonna move on and take questions, but if you have other things that you wanna work on, please add them into the chat, because it's great to see what everyone is working on and where you're focusing your efforts. At this time, also, I'd like you to take a minute and make sure, if you haven't, I know many of you put your name at the beginning, but if you haven't included your name at the beginning, please list your name now, your full name, if you want CTLE credit. So go ahead and list your name, and we'll make sure that that list is shared and you'll get your CTLE credit. And I love how the names are all mixed in with your goals too. So we have our goals and the next steps that you're going to take. So thank you very much for sharing those.
And this is not a waterfall chat. Just go ahead and enter at any time. Yeah.
That's right. And if you have any questions right now, please feel free to share them in the Q&A box so we don't get them mixed up with the CTLE credit. And we're happy, Diane and I are happy to answer your questions now.
We can take a couple here at the end. And just thinking about, you know, the timing of this webinar, how we all have so much going on, it really is a great time to start thinking about next year, right? So what are you going to prioritize in terms of advocating for multilingual learners and their families? Now's a great time to be thinking ahead to next year. You know, next year might be looking very different for many of you as more schools are moving towards 5-day in-person learning. So, you know, what are your thoughts moving forward in terms of advocacy? Yeah, and that's a great lead in. I see a question from Joni that asks, any suggestions on how to ensure MLL needs are not lost as schools worry and plan for pandemic gap? Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great question. And that, you know, I would think about, you know, how do we build in social emotional learning? How do we really strengthen that? Not just looking at, you know, I assume you're talking about, you know, test scores and so-called learning loss. I really don't like that term, learning loss. Our kids have learned so much this year about resiliency, about determination, about adversity. Unfortunately and fortunately, right? They've had to go through so much. So I would be thinking of, you know, what's your role in that, and who can you be collaborating with? What can you plan moving forward? I always like in my work, and then I found, you know, in my varied roles, to come with a plan, present a plan to your administrator on what you would like to do. Being proactive is really key in all of this. And, you know, working with a couple of colleagues or a few colleagues to put forth a plan that's actionable, that's reachable next year, to look at supporting MLLs throughout, you know, people's focus on making up those test scores or, you know, catching up on lost learning. That's what I would think about. And I see a great conversation taking place in the chat as well. Yeah, keeping a focus on student-centered needs, sharing MLL practices, absolutely. Yeah, sharing, you know, these practices in bite-sized pieces. Just, you know, a 5-minute PD on a strategy someone could use, for example, that they can take and share in their own classrooms. Yeah, making new lesson and unit templates that purposefully include SEL practices or mindful moments. Yeah, we really need to build this into our curriculum throughout the year, and all teachers, not just ELL teachers or bilingual teachers, ensuring that multilingual learners are included thoughtfully in SEL practices. And that's an area we're going to be exploring more in depth as well over the next coming months. Yeah. Erica says, as an ELL myself, I always put on the student shoes and their families. Absolutely. Great. Any other questions or thoughts as we're moving forward and thinking about the next school year and wrapping up this year?
I see Rosario says she wants to be able to include more opportunities for students to have choice in their learning and involving them in the planning. And I think that's great as you think about planning units that give student choice, that offer peer learning opportunities, that are cross-curricular, and really build in opportunities for language development as well, right?
Absolutely.
We have posted a copy of the PowerPoint on the Padlet, so you can find it on the Padlet.
I'll share that link again too.
All right. Great. So again, our objectives for the day were to discuss, whoops, just a sec, to discuss the role of advocacy in fostering culturally responsive teaching climate for multilingual learners and their family, explore 5 steps for advocacy, reflect on tools and strategies, and then set goals for applying these to your own context. So thank you so much for your great participation. We really appreciate it. We have some supporting resources that are free tools and videos, more videos from Syracuse City School District. Diane's just shared the link. So we encourage you to check those out. And we would like you to share, give us feedback, tell us what you liked, what we could do better. So we'll share that link in the chat also, if you wouldn't mind taking a few minutes to give us some feedback. And again, if you have any questions or there's anything you want to reach out to us about, feel free. Here are our emails, Sydney or Diane at getsupported.net. Thank you so much. We really appreciate you. Were great participants. You had so much to say, and we loved hearing about all the work that you're already doing to advocate for culturally responsive teaching in your context.
Thanks again. Thanks for joining us, and have a great rest of your day and night.
Great.